We have hosted multiple webinars in the past few years about return to work and Bill C-41, and each session has ended with many more questions still yet to address. So today, we thought we would bring back two experts and dive specifically into the challenge and roadblocks that arise with mental health related claims. We'll explore real-world examples of what can happen in the work when a worker submits a mental health claim, from medical notes and confidentiality and all types of accommodation and communication requirements. If you have any questions, please ask through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Today, we are here to answer your questions and hopefully lead you on a path that really supports workers in the workplace. We have a short list of questions remaining. From previous work webinars to start us off, but we'll leave extra time for your questions at the end of today's session. On our panel today, bringing back again Amanda Peck, Technical Claims Specialist, Allied Partner, TextMed Services, and our own Dr. Steve Conway, Director of Leadership and Psychological Safety for the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC. For our audience members who may not be familiar, we'll start off with some quick introductions, and then we'll get right into some of those questions from the last time you joined us. So good morning, Steve and Amanda.
Good morning.
Morning.
So maybe just a quick introduction. I'll start with Amanda. Just tell us about you.
Yeah, so my background's in disability management. I'm very grateful to do a lot of the webinars with both you and Steve and workshops. I've been here over 15 years now. Currently, I am the claims team leader, so I am happy to provide some insight from the disability management side on these mental health topics.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us again. Steve.
Well, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm Steve, and you know what, the tragic thing is I'm approaching 35 years of experience, which in some ways that's a good thing, but in other ways it just reminds me how I'm getting old. So, and at the Alliance, my primary role is to work with our members and leaders and, helping them navigate the nuances of creating psychologically safe environments that reduce mental health issues. So I'm happy to be here, and hopefully I have some value to share with you today.
Excellent. Well, thank you for both of you joining, and I know we've got a lot of questions to get through today, so maybe I'll start kicking off with the first question on our board. So mental health is still tough, a tough subject to tackle. No one wants to talk about their feelings at work. And often when we'll find that they're avoiding the issue, we make things sometimes worse. What are some of the useful strategies to encourage conversation and discourage avoidance in the workplace?
All right. Well, I can, Amanda, if you want, I can take a stab at this first one.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to take the stab at it, and then I
You're
can
too
add my
polite.
thoughts, kind of personal experience on that.
Mhm. Well, I think the first thing we want to do, first, we have to understand that, everybody has mental health, right? When we talk about mental health, we're not talking about mental illness. Mental health is a continuum from being healthy and well all the way to having something that would be diagnosable. So we have to understand what it is, but we also have to, we have to combat the stigma that surrounds the topic because too many people are afraid of saying, hey, you know what, I'm struggling. They worry about if their employer or colleagues found out, they might, lose out on a promotion, for example, might be treated differently. So we need to normalize the topic. Mental health issues, mental health illnesses should be regarded in the same way that physical illnesses are. And it's really helpful, I think, for leaders to set that tone, to normalize it, to make it a conversation piece in staff meetings, and just kind of take the emotional temperature. How are you feeling today? And be prepared for the answer. I think the more we just get people talking about that feelings aren't a bad thing. In fact, feelings and emotions, they're information, they're data. They help us make decisions. So I think the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it, it makes people feel safer. And I really think that normalizing starts with leader behavior. how they make the topic accessible to people, how they bring it up, right? So that employees know, my boss, he's talking about it in a respectful way, so I think he's safe to bring it up too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say for me personally, having stepped into a leadership role, I think just having the conversation on a regular basis. It's not a strange thing where we step aside. I try to touch base with my team every week. We talk about all sorts of things, obviously the work stuff, but also how they're doing and checking in. And I think it also helps you if you're in a leadership position, keep a vibe on how people are doing. You notice the little things that are off and that are going on. So when it comes up, it's not a surprise conversation. I think the other big thing is just modeling, being mindful of it, being okay to say, hey, I'm a little overwhelmed this week. This is how I'm organizing my week and strategizing and coping with that. Makes it a little less taboo for them to say, hey, I'm really struggling with this piece. I could use some support on that. So, yeah, 100% agree with you.
And I think, and trust is such an important driver for employee performance and engagement. And I think well, a couple of the best ways to create trust is for leaders to be authentic,
Hmm.
right? To kind of to model the behavior that they want to see. But also another important driver for trust is showing empathy. And empathy is something that humans have. We might not always be strong at it, but it's a skill that we can develop. And really, when we're talking about empathy, is just, you know, noticing how people are feeling, trying to put yourself in their shoes and responding appropriately. So if we want trust, which is something that we need if we want employees to say, hey, I'm struggling, we need that authenticity as leaders and we need to, exercise that empathy muscle frequently.
Hopefully, I don't echo anymore. Is it better?
Yeah, I don't hear you echoing.
Okay, good. Um, that's an interesting, I like empathy. And I think that as I've gotten a few gray hairs, empathy has been probably a little bit more well developed. When I was younger, as a young, manager, young executive, I have to admit, I lacked empathy. I was really looking to see, well, it was all about performance. My bosses were saying, look, it's about top line sales, bottom line productivity. We need production, production, production. And you, as a leader, find yourself between a rock and a hard place between being empathetic and meeting the goals and meeting the outputs. Because let's face it, in manufacturing, I spent 25 years in manufacturing all around the globe. And I have to tell you, like, it's thin margin, it's not always that we're making a ton of money. So it is about getting things done, low cost production, and the pressure is on. And so, what would you say? It's great to say empathy. I hear what you're saying, but how do you balance empathy with you've got a lot of pressures as a leader? And so you got all this stuff going on in your head, and you blow right past empathy because you see what you've got to do. So I'm curious of what, um, thoughts you have on how a leader can slow down the chatter, slow down, and actually take, that second look and be a more empathetic leader while still meeting those targets and goals and
Mhm.
requirements for employment.
Yeah, and I think we want to dispel the myth that empathy is about being nice.
Yeah,
I'm just being nice. I'm not. What we really want to be talking about with empathy is we want to be able to balance relationship with accountability,
yeah,
Yeah.
right? And we got to think, if we have tight deadlines, if we have margins, if we have, quality control, how do we get that done in an effective way if we have employees who are not well? If we have employees who are distracted, distracted employees because they're worried about how they're feeling or what's going on in their lives are more likely to make mistakes.
yeah,
They're more likely to have accidents, right? So we want to take empathy out of this realm of, oh, I'm just a nice person. And we want to put empathy in the realm of this actually create without empathy, it creates operational risk. There's more likelihood that we won't meet our targets and people will get hurt. So empathy is one of those things where it's simply, if somebody's struggling, right, rather than come down on them, like come down hard on them right away, it's simply having that conversation is, I've noticed that, you've been making a few mistakes lately. What's going on? What is there something that I need to know? And if that employee is saying, I haven't been sleeping, I've been struggling, Okay. Well, thanks for telling me about that. And having a conversation about what can we do that's appropriate. So you're not turning into a therapist, but so that's appropriate to have that employee, that issue looked at. 'Cause the same way you might have an employee who's not wearing their PPEs, right? And you say, you got to wear your PPEs. And if you just say, wear it, you can direct it, but people don't always follow direction. But if you stop and say, what's going on here? Is there something I need to know? Yeah, the goggles don't fit over my glasses. I can't see otherwise. So empathy is also about slowing down and asking the question, is there something I need to know? How's it going for you?
I think that's a very proactive approach to it too, right? Like that when
Yeah.
you're having those conversations, even not having a conversation, I don't think has ever solved a problem by just ignoring it. It's just that minefield waiting to go off later. So I think if you're being proactive and you're having those conversations, and it's building that rapport, that trust, that communication back and forth, but also operationally, like you touched on, Wayne, for a lot of businesses, that's going to allow you to kind of have some insight into things you might need to do, changes that might need to be made before it's a must do.
Mhm.
I think there's always a lot more flexibility if you're approaching those things proactively. If you guys have ever sat in on one of my workshops, I say do it all before. Don't wait until somebody's having a mental health issue or illness or injury at work and then scramble to try and put all these things in place. So that being prepared, that exploring options, keeping in touch with your people and your staff and a pulse on what's going on, I think can make a huge difference in the outcomes of those things when they do come up.
Mhm. Yeah, I like the
Yeah.
focus on prevention. I think
Yeah.
it's much better. It's much better for the individual, but it's much better for the organization. So you can take a problem that is small and prevent it from being something that is, potentially catastrophic
Yep.
just by paying attention early and tuning into that empathy because people, whether we like to admit it or not, whether we enjoy the idea, people are emotional beings. Feelings, you can't separate a person from their feelings. So if they're distracted by something that's going on at home, they're going to come and it's probably going to show up at work. And an empathy is just being able to spot this employee is behaving in a way that makes me wonder, do I need to check in?
Yeah, I think that's an important part. And I think, one of the things that you and I talk about, Steve, a lot is around, you know, I look at it from years of running plants where, we look at people that become leaders in different ways, like the beginning leader, right? So you've got the lead hand that becomes eventually the supervisor, that eventually becomes the manager, that then becomes the people leader, the directors, etc. But there's not a lot of training. I mean, you're just absorbing, and you're figuring it out as you go. And I think that one of the things that I like that we touch on here is giving leaders nuggets of how to be good leaders, because it's not like we send you to typically leadership school and you do a full indoctrination on how to be a good leader, how to be a good communicator, how to overcome, you know, um, personality conflicts, cultural conflicts, all these things that happen in the workplace, fluid. And so I think this will be, obviously another segue into another conversation or another webinar, but it's so important because the development of those people leaders is critical, and we don't spend enough time because we're so busy getting production done. And to your point, how do you become authentic when you're just feeling deadlines, cash flow, all this stuff? You as a leader, if you're not trained on how to slow down, and actually be aware of the people side of things, you could lose a lot of great people to just this one simple fact of, how do you shut that chatter down and be present, or do you get enough training to be a good
Mhm.
people leader? But any final thoughts on that before I move to another question? But this is a loaded conversation.
Yeah, I do. And I think to echo what you're saying, most people, and I think this is kind of true across the board, most people get elevated into leadership or management roles because they have those technical competencies. They have those
Yeah.
so-called hard skills like, you know, experience, the technical knowledge, the cognitive abilities. Those are critical. You need those to be successful.
Mhm.
But the problem is we typically focus solely on those things and don't really pay attention to the so-called soft skills, which are really not soft. They're extremely impactful, like
Yep.
communication, conflict resolution,
Yep.
how do I,
Absolutely.
relational skills. Yeah, because you could have all those technical skills, but if you can't translate those in a way that people want to follow you, it doesn't mean much,
Absolutely.
right?
Yep.
So people need that full package, and I agree, they don't get trained in that.
Yeah. It's been one of my biggest challenges and opportunities. I mean, I'll be honest, when I first started out, 30 something years ago, I was coined as a bull in a china shop. I just was full of, the technical skills, but I didn't have necessarily the slow down, the gray. I had the black and the white, but not the gray, where I could really see. And it was a real turning point in my management style when I started to recognize I needed to see the gray, the empathy and the authentic. I had to show up and show that I actually cared about the individuals that were working these stations. So really some great points. And I want to probably dive in that a little bit more later, but let's kind of go back to a couple other questions that we had here. There are critical challenges employers must be aware of with mental health claims versus other types of claims. What are those challenges and what are you seeing, Amanda, in this area and how can we support our members better in this area?
I mean, I don't know that that doesn't tie into what we were just talking about. A lot of
Yeah.
what I see from the employer side is uncertainty about how to
Right.
approach it, right? Um, do I call them? Should I not call them? Can I still ask for information? Do I not ask for information? Should I offer, an accommodation or modified duties? That's, I'm going to say, the bulk of the questions we get from them and from the employer's perspective. And again, it goes back to that training. You have to look at that like an investment, not just in your people and your business, but also like the claims outcomes, all of those things, because you can see from a disability management side when somebody who's invested in their skills as a people leader, how to navigate those things, how to have those conversations, handling a situation versus maybe a supervisor on the floor that's never been given that opportunity to explore those topics or really have any guidance or coaching on that. It has a very dramatic impact on the approach that's taken with that injured person, on the claims outcomes. It's very operationally focused. I need you back here. What do you mean you have to wait 6 months for an assessment? And it really starts to go sideways very quickly. So I think it's hugely important to seek out resources. I mean, I know personally I've sat in on some of Steve's leadership things. And just coming to today's webinar, right? To get yourself educated, to consider these things before it happens, and to consider making sure that you're talking about it at work, not just with your staff, but with your supervisors, the leadership, the people who are having those day-to-day communications, because you can see the path that that recovery is going to go very quickly in a claim. And it usually starts with how it starts off. What were those initial communications like? And when we're talking about somebody who's dealing with a mental health illness or injury, they've seen something traumatic, having those first conversations get messy or be approached the wrong way really sets a tone that we then later have to kind of claw back. And that's unfortunate because a lot of times it is preventable, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great points.
Yeah, and I think, and mental health injuries, I mean, as I'm sure you know, like they're less visible
Hmm.
in many ways. It's not like somebody, breaks an arm, for example. You can see the injury. And so they're less visible. They can also, be more variable, like day to day and how they show up because,
Yeah.
your symptoms might be more intense one day than the other. So again, sometimes it's hard to also translate into um, clear functional restrictions in that way. We also have to keep in mind, though, stigma is still a real issue.
Yeah.
Yep.
Stigma prevents of like a significant number of people from getting the help that we know actually works really well. And
Hmm.
because the stigma is real, people can delay the reporting of it. They might minimize their symptoms or, and like Amanda said, depending on how those early conversations go, they could disengage completely if they're feeling judged or minimized.
Yep.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think we see the statistics, Steve, on this, but again, we I don't think we really recognize that, again, the male population. This is something that I speak about a lot. It's still very one of the highest levels of stigma still felt within males reporting it. I don't want to let anyone know if you work in a real macho male environment, manufacturing environment, I'm not going to let my friends or my colleagues know that I'm not well today. And so there lies part of the problem. We have to really work hard to break down those walls of stigma. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I think that's a great point. This came up previously and I wanted to revisit this question. So, how do the provisions of Bill 41 redefine the extent of an employer's responsibility in supporting an employee's mental health? And where is the line between organizational duty and personal accountability? Great question.
Yeah, I don't I don't know that it redefines it. I would argue that it clarifies it. I think
Mhm.
those responsibilities and obligations have existed for some time in one way or another. I think Bill 41 effectively clarified that and confirmed that in terms of specifically occupational injuries. So I don't know that it changed anything, but what it did is it set out some of the answers to those questions for employers. The duty to cooperate provides that you do have a right to ask for limitations, restrictions into a worker's recovery. It confirms that there is an obligation to start those conversations, a duty to inquire, a duty to reach out, to maintain that back and forth. And same for workers, that there's a little bit of an obligation there to make sure you're maintaining communication and stuff. So I think it confirmed it. I don't think it changed it. But I do think it helps steer things in the right direction, and that these are things that really previously were kind of considered nice to do. Nice employers would follow up with you, you know what I mean? And it wasn't really an obligation. And this is saying, no, it's an obligation. And I mean, Steve touched on it earlier. If you're not inquiring when you see something's off, that's a lot more likely to lead to an injury down the road anyway. So it's not that those things were being mitigated before, they were often being ignored, and they turned into really complex claims on from a disability management standpoint. Um, you would see claims come through where people were providing 3 or 4 years of a buildup of incidents, right? That's where that gradual onset came on. So, or gradual exposure. So I think it's a much more proactive push now. We want to get ahead of it. We want to address it kind of in the moment with those initial incidents, those isolated incidents, for better outcomes. And I think communication is a huge part of that. So keeping that communication open, exploring that, knowing your obligations there, what you can ask and not ask, just supports those good outcomes.
Mhm.
Digging into this a little bit for Steve and you, you talked about that, started happening 2, 3, 4 years ago. Again, I think it's tough for those folks that are maybe listening to really understand um, that there is a difference between, you know, a mental health claim and something, bullying and harassment and all these other things that we kind of see colliding in the workplace, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Accountability is not bullying and harassment,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
yet when you start to really dig in and uncouple these things, I think providing really good sound advice and guidance for managers on how to prevent the coupling of all this together.
Mhm.
Because I think it really is still a messy area. We certainly have seen a massive shift in the workforce. They're very informed, maybe ill-informed, misinformed, right? And then that leads to maybe some confusion around these different topics. I want to give this back to you guys to, maybe just kind of walk through how you might decouple some of this stuff as an employer or as a manager.
I mean, yeah, yes, there's a lot of talk right now around psychological safety, which is it's an idea that's been around for a long time. And psychological safety is often misunderstood. And so if you think about psychological safety, it is that shared belief, and this is an idea coined by Amy Edmondson, but it's that shared belief that employers can make a mistake, they can speak up, they can ask questions without fear of negative consequences or punishment, right? And so sometimes, and I've heard this that, with people leaders say, yeah, but now how do I do my job? Well, we got to understand, there's a difference between creating conditions where people feel safe to contribute at their best, but as a manager, you still have responsibilities. And those responsibilities include, performance management, providing direction, giving feedback. That's an essential function of being in a management role. As long as you are doing that in a way that is respectful and tactful, that avoids the bullying and harassment tactics, which were, I think, pretty familiar to those of us who have been around a little while. As
Yeah.
long as you do it that way, you are actually on side, right? You are not doing anything wrong. And so I think, it's a pity that sometimes that psychological safety idea has been weaponized because it is still one of those ideas. If we allow employees to go to work without that fear of punishment,
Yeah.
they perform better because they're no longer worried about being a target, which means that they're not in the stress response. That means that their prefrontal cortex is engaged so they can think clearly, they can make decisions better, they can collaborate, they can problem solve, and they can work safely. So we just want to make sure we always have to keep in mind it's relationship with accountability. Those two go hand in hand. If it's all about the relationship, you sometimes lose the accountability. If it's all about the accountability at the expense of relationship, you're going to have workers who are more likely to experience stress. Their performance goes down, more likely to get sick, more likely to have mental health issues. So it's that balance that we have to achieve.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Amanda, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean oh, it is confusing and sometimes they can be very complex. And honestly, Wayne, I've seen claims. It's hard for me because I've seen them where there's a traumatic incident and there's bullying harassment and there's,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
trying to go back and suss those things out sometimes can be really hard to separate them. And again, that goes back to usually because something has happened and maybe it's been overlooked or it hasn't been addressed initially, so it's kind of convoluted. If you have somebody who, let's say, for example, somebody's hurt on the floor and they lose a finger or hand, they have a trauma, and somebody witnesses that, and they're having a response to that, and that response is kind of shush shush, like suck it up, as Steve would say, get back to work, you're fine, and he's fine, let him worry about it. You see that start to come back sometimes on claims in terms of like, then there was a mental health component, then my supervisor, wasn't very supportive. So it's really important right from the get to go to be on top of it, to deal with it, to have really clear communications about it, to document things, because as employers have obligations to address performance issues, operational standards, all those kind of things. And it's not what you say often, it's how it's said or how it's delivered. That's where we get into a real gray area where people are going, now it's bullying and harassment, now it's mental stress, now it's this. So
Yeah.
making sure your teams are clear on how those things need to be addressed. They have some training on how to address them without, demeaning a person or going into these other things. And then I think when they do come up, getting it out there, having those conversations and dealing with it initially, as opposed to trying to kind of avoid it because it's scary and it is complex often,
Mhm.
usually leads to it being a lot easier to suss out what's work related, what's not work related, and where these things kind of got all intermixed.
Maybe diving a little bit onto that. I mean, having had a few traumatic situations in the workplace,
Mhm.
what would be your guys' recommendation on how employers handle that, whether it be, a significant injury or other? But, we do have these things. And I
Mhm.
think that I know I was 25 years old and I had a extremely significant injury. And I remember walking up that evening or running up that evening to deal with it. And I had several of my plant staff were completely distraught,
Yeah,
obviously seeing that. And I don't, to this day, I really kind of thought I was doing the right thing, but there was no manual. Like, what do you do
yeah,
when this happens? And I look at the trauma as I still am in contact with some of those guys that worked in that plant. There's still lingering trauma from that one isolated incident, and we still kind of speak about it. So how do we help people in those situations? Like, is there
so
a good path? a
I
better
think
path.
I think the first thing is to keep in mind it's going to be different for every situation.
Sure.
And even if you have four people witness the same event, they're all going to have a different reaction. And I've literally seen that come across my desk where an employer says, I don't understand because Steve and Wayne were there and they're fine. Joe doesn't want to come to work tomorrow. So I think understanding that everybody's coming into a situation with their own perspective, their own, maybe they have pre-existing trauma, maybe they've witnessed something before, maybe there's been a prior work incident. So all those things come into play. And then I think understanding and appreciating that you can have an injury at work and it can be traumatic for the person who is injured, but in some cases it can be traumatic for the people around them too. And the approach on those claims is going to be a little bit different. And again, I think it's you do the best you can. I don't think there's a manual for that because it's very specific to each person. It's
Yeah.
very specific to the incident. But I think just that perspective, keeping an open mind, open communication, and tying back into what Steve said, having some empathy, listening. Like, how was this for that person? What was their reaction? Why is it so triggering? And it's almost like reverse engineering a solution. When you really understand why somebody is having the response they're having, and hopefully you can create that rapport with them, it's a lot easier to address the barriers, right? I mean, that's our first step when we're approaching a claim and speaking to a worker is really trying to understand what's going on. And as you're listening to someone and they're saying, now approaching this machine, my heart's beating, and okay, maybe that machine, maybe that's going to be the barrier. That's the exposure there. So let's remove that from the equation right now and lower that stress response. And now the person's feeling supported because you're hearing what they're saying. You're also able to navigate what that return to work looks like and a better outcome. And because you're acknowledging that and you're not just ignoring it, you're not pushing them back in a situation that's going to make that trauma worse, right? And then there goes the outcome out the window again. You're not going to have a positive outcome. So it's really nuanced, and I don't know that anybody can beat themselves up. I mean, you know what you know, and you have the skills you have in the moment. Um, but I think trying to educate yourself, trying to keep an open mind, trying to keep those open conversations going, and just approach it, I guess, with empathy and some perspective really helps you navigate that a bit better.
And I think I really appreciate the point that you make. People will respond differently. And so if we're looking for a blanket response, it's really hard to pin that one down. And what happens, so you can have the initial traumatic event, right, which will, obviously for some people lead to a psychological injury. The way the organization responds to it can
Yeah.
create a secondary traumatic injury. And so I think, one of a really helpful approach that a lot of organizations do is they engage in what's called psychological first aid. So when an incident happens, it's really peer-led, so you don't have to call in high-paid experts. But what you do is you train, a number of your employees to be able to identify when a traumatic event happens. Basically, it's the sitting with that person, listening to them, not giving advice, not being a therapist, not doing any of those things. It's really a lot of listening and being in that space for that person to just talk or be.
Yeah.
The evidence around that is pretty significant that is huge in terms of just,
Yeah.
reducing the likelihood of a post-traumatic stress type of response. But it also, signals that the employer has says, hey, we take this seriously and we've actually trained people to do this. And
Yeah.
again, I think the good news is that you don't have to be a mental health therapist. In fact, it's actually better if you're not to
Yeah.
do this. So it's peer to peer.
Yeah.
But again, I think, this empathy word, it keeps coming back because it is people are driven by how we feel.
Yeah.
If we feel safe and supported, we bring our best selves to work. If
Yeah.
we don't feel safe and supported, we go into defensive mode, right? Or
Yeah.
we shut down. And that doesn't lead to, we were talking, Wayne, about, the margins, and you will never meet those when you have distressed, unwell people,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And, in long has been the idea that, people were just, completely replaceable. You just, oh, if this person doesn't want to work, you can just replace them. We have to move away from that mentality. And I think we have in some ways, but I think we also have a long ways to go. And I think through this education, and again, we do offer the first aid training as well as a lot of psychological health and safety training. So if you're an organization that thinks that they may benefit from that, please do reach out. But I think it's 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 such an important part because you don't know what you don't know, and providing some people some nuggets just to know that there is support, there is help, and certainly not one situation is going to be out of a playbook, so to speak. You're going to have to uniquely handle it. And I think to what you said, Steve, that authenticness, the empathy is really key here. I'm going to go back to another mental health claims question here. How can employers proactively set expectations for clear and consistent communication with workers while on leave? For example, how often should an employer reach out? What if there's no response? What about the concerns around maybe the work causing more mental health damage? uh, or anxiety along the way by, my boss keeps just calling me. Don't they realize I'm off on a mental health claim? They're triggering me. These are real good questions because I know that in my past, we give you the form, you go off, we get a doctor's note, and we wouldn't even talk to you for the term of that time because we didn't want to bother you. We didn't want to cause trauma or seem like we were pestering you to come back to work. So these are real, but what is the balance? What's the line? How have we changed in this area? And especially with mental health, it's very different. So what should we do here?
Yeah, I think balance is the key, right? Because you don't want to pester somebody, but then there's that balance of becoming disconnected from the workplace as well, which can be equally as damaging, right? When you're off and you have that stigma and that idea that everybody's talking about it, everybody knows, trying to return just becomes a bigger and bigger hardship. So, I think it starts before the claim with that kind of top-down discussions about this is how we approach things. This is what all our team and I need everybody. This is how you're going to approach it if somebody comes to you or they're having a mental health injury. This is the message we want to communicate. This is the approach we want to take. And then I think when it happens, having those conversations right off the get-go. First off, you're prepared, so okay, I need to speak to this person. I need to have a conversation with them. I need to make sure it's not on the floor. Maybe it's not me. Maybe I'm not the best person to have the conversation, right? That's a huge oversight with a lot of organizations is maybe they have Joe call the worker, but Joe's a really gruff kind of person and they're not the person you go have a heart to heart with, but this guy's doing all the communication back and forth with the worker and you can just see it spiraling. So making sure that as an organization there's an understanding of who's going to take lead on that communication and managing that back and forth with the worker and getting that in place right away. And it doesn't have to be a high pressure conversation. And my background's disability management. So people are like, I called him right away and I asked him to come back to work. Aren't you proud? And sometimes that first conversation just needs to be, hey, how are you? What happened? How are you doing? What's going on? Are you getting some support? Are you aware we have all these things for you? You know, that can change the whole tone of a conversation and a return to work plan. So I think having everybody within the organization kind of clear on what that looks like, these are the steps we want to take. If you're not sure, this is the conversation, or you can come to me and we can sort that out. That's where it starts. And then I think, yeah, you are entitled to things. So then the education piece. So knowing that, yes, you can ask for medical, you can ask how the worker's doing. You can, in that first conversation, be honest and say, hey, like, I'd like to touch base with you bi-weekly. How does that sound? Are you okay if I call you? Is it easier for you if you give me a call every Thursday? Would you like to communicate by email? Like setting all those things up for success right in the beginning is really the key point there.
And having it be a collaborative process.
Yeah.
You don't want to turn the situation where the employee thinks you're an adversary. You
Mhm.
want that to the best of your ability. You want to have them think that you're an ally in their recovery. So I agree. I totally set those expectations early and communicate, how would it work best for you? These are the things that that we need to do. How can we make that work more effectively? And I think it is really important to keep in touch with people because particularly on a mental health leave, people people will have, the self-talk that they engage in, the worry about stigma, the worry about their job, all they can become easily magnified. And we want to, you want to be humane with this person and just say, this is your time to recover, right? This is what your focus is, and not kind of instill pressure or fear for that person. But it is important to communicate, if there's some significant changes, and when you were talking about this, I was smiling thinking about, I remember this individual I worked with years ago, and he was telling me about a job that he had, and he took a leave, he was off on leave, and no one communicated with him either. And on his first day back, he went to the office, well, where the office used to be, and the office was gone.
Oh.
And he's like, "Wh- he had no one told him that there was a
Mm,
change of address,
wow.
right? So you think
Mm.
about these things and just imagine the impact on somebody if they have a new manager, for example. So we want to also be thinking not just when they're off, but how do we transition them back to be successful?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, their old manager might be gone, and that may be a smiley day. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be.
So it
Yeah.
could be.
And
Yeah.
I'll add to that too. I've had claims this year where I've been really impressed with some organizations, and they've had, they have workers and maybe first responders are in really heady positions, and it's hard to bring those kind of people back, especially same with manufacturing. If you're a machine operator and this trauma is related to that machine, that can be hard to bring somebody back, even just on the floor where there's that exposure, right? But
Yeah.
really think outside the box. Are there monthly town halls you guys have? Are there union meetings? Are there those outside work activities that that
Mhm.
person could still be extended an invitation to?
Yeah.
And the difference that can make in that work connection and helping to ease them back in the work environment because they're still connecting with their managers, they're still connecting with their coworkers. They don't feel like they're disconnected from everything or ostracized from everything. That can have a massive impact on a claims outcome.
Yeah. We want to think
Yeah.
it's not like a breakup where you go no call,
Yeah.
right? This is a relationship that is just, it's undergoing repair, and
Mhm.
we want to keep in contact so that person can come back and be successful.
Yeah.
We're at that time where I've got to kind of get into the audience questions here. So I'm going to give you a few in advance here. So let's talk about return to work first, and then we'll talk quickly about a few other ones. So return to work. What do you do when you're managing occupational physical injury claim and mental health struggles are a barrier to returning to work? So if the mental health condition is not accepted by WorkSafe, what are other resources or other supports available to employers?
Yeah, I mean, that's so they're saying if it's denied as an occupational claim, I mean,
Yeah. Oh,
that's where
if
you
it's
really,
accepted. If
oh,
the
if it's
mental health
accepted.
condition is, oh yeah, not accepted. Yes, you're right.
Is
Sorry.
not accepted. Yeah. So if it's not accepted, so there's a few key points I want to make there. First off, WorkSafe BC has identified there's a huge lag in getting those psychological assessments. So there's often a longer period where that claim's sitting there pending. And even if it may be denied and everybody suspects, okay, it might be denied, there are some counseling sessions and different mental health resources that you can leverage the board for while that claim's sitting and pending. And that getting just even, 6 to 8 counseling sessions right away can make a huge difference, right? You don't want to sit there for 8 months, then have it also denied. Now your worker's been off work for 8 months. The claim's denied. No help from WorkSafe BC. They're still off work. I think also making sure that you're reviewing things like your EAP, your benefits package, stuff like that,
Yeah.
to make sure that you have other options to add. There's community resources that you can reach out to. I don't have them off the top of my head, but I'm happy to send some links for you guys to share with your members of different things where you can explore some of the different resources because you do still have to address that as an employer, from an HR perspective. But I think initially, does it matter if it's going to be denied or not? No, you want to provide as much support as you can. So pushing for as many of those interventions as you can is really going to lead to success.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think sometimes, the decision is made based on the presence of a diagnosable mental health issue.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You do not need to have a diagnosable mental health issue to have psychological distress,
Mhm.
right? You can have a psychological injury that is maybe sub-threshold of a diagnosis, but that person is still struggling. And so, I think again, I agree. I always agree with Amanda. She knows what she's talking about. But having those resources around EAP or extended health, again, you don't have to be in psychological crisis to access those, but those provide a valuable psychosocial support for that person as they're going through this process.
Yeah, and I'll say as a business leader, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of checking out your EAP program. I find that in a lot of cases, I mean, when they're packaged up by benefit programs, benefit providers, they are, the least amount to really get the employee any kind of manageable support. In some cases, I would call these programs describing the water while they're drowning. They get one consultation, maybe a consultation and a half in funding, and then they're kind of left well, now what? Because
Mhm.
my benefits have run out. So I really encourage leaders to have a look at their EAP programs, making sure that there is a robust enough support for employees. And in, literally, you can. We are thankful we've partnered with and created MSA Care. We have a new benefit program for employers that again address providing adequate benefits, especially EAP benefits for employers, because you need them, and you don't want to be causing the problem. Or additional problems when they get access. They finally made that first phone call to Access Health, and then their benefit has been exhausted. So again, I just want to emphasize that. Continue on. What are employers' options for return to work where an employee's been offered a long-term mental health claim, is preparing now returning. However, the worker-employer relationship is very poor, and I think this is probably you see this more than not, because they've
Yeah,
been
and I
off a
mean,
long time. How do you backfill that role a little bit, right? And
yeah,
mhm,
it comes down again to communication. I mean, the point is to hopefully try and avoid that. Hopefully, we're not having somebody come back, after an extended leave and there's been zero communication. Nobody knows where anybody stands. Like that's kind of worst case scenario. Um, if it does come up like that, I think the first step is just having a conversation. And what that looks like, I think, again, is going to depend on the situation. I think it could be a communication by email, by phone, but ideally having that person having a sit down face to face conversation with maybe that person, maybe including the treatment providers. A lot of times, from a disability management standpoint, we'll do things called return to work planning meetings where we kind of invite all the stakeholders to the table. So it'll look like the worker who's dealing with the illness, their treatment provider, a case manager from WCB, the employer, all those people, the supervisor, to sit down and say, hey, this is where we're at. Joe's ready to return to work. Let's just start the conversation. Like, Joe, what are your fears? Where are your concerns? Organization, what accommodations do you have? Is there anything that you can't be flexible on off the bat? Like, what are the barriers there? And then just start compiling those lists and getting everybody talking. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the next morning or today we have to have that plan drafted out, but just getting that kind of conversation started and starting to rebuild that back and forth and communication and relationship with the workplace, right?
yeah, yeah,
I think, the consistency, predictable, and relational, because again, that's how those are particularly the consistency part. That's how trust gets rebuilt.
Mhm.
yeah,
And so I think, having that point person or a manager who can be, calm and relational and has those skills is going to be important. And I think, it is. It's setting the groundwork, and I think you can't rush that process. You can't just go no contact and then lay it all down on that person, say, well, this is going to the way it is. You're coming back to work. That is gonna result in a likely and a negative outcome. So I think just taking some time and having multiple conversations just to kind of turn that, like warm up the temperature and rebuild some of that trust is going to be essential. And focus again on like things like the workload, the pace, the demands of the job that's coming up, you know, that exposure to those kind of situations that might be triggering to them. The more you can allay that employee's fears and the address their concerns, but also make sure that we're not leading to circumstances where the psychological injury can be exacerbated or re-triggered. Because it's a delicate time when they come back to work.
Yeah, yeah. I know we're going to run out of time, and there's a ton of great
As
questions.
always.
As I'm scanning down here, I'm going, "Holy cow, that's a great question." But I'm going to pick off one that's coupled with another. And Steve, going back to we've talked a lot about it, but it seems to be kind of threaded with a few questions. How are you going to teach empathy in an industry where realistically the goal is production? First part. So think about that. But the other part is that so yeah, you've got this, your boss needs to teach empathy or be empathetic or your supervisor, right? So how do you create that? But then also what happens when your boss is dealing with maybe a mental health? And we talked about this. We talked about worker mental health through the pandemic and everything, but what about the boss's mental health through the
Mhm.
pandemic? They had stressors too, and did they ever address them? Did they ever seek help? And so there's kind of the two sides of this. So empathy, how do we,
Yeah,
deal with the empathy? And then what do you do when you got a boss that clearly is maybe a little
two-parter.
in need of help?
So first
Yeah,
of all, yeah, empathy. I mean, we think of empathy as a natural trait. Either you got it or you don't. I hear people say,
right.
I don't have empathy. Empathy it's a skill set that we can learn. And some
Yeah,
people will be more naturally empathic than others.
yeah,
And, part of it is, being curious. When somebody says, I'm feeling this way, rather than kind of going into a judgment, oh, this person's just lazy, they just don't want to work. That curious mind is like, okay, what do I need to know more about? The simple fact of just being curious and asking questions and hearing that person's perspective is a start to developing empathy. Now, mind you, I do workshops on how to develop empathy that take more than 30 seconds. So,
sure. But that's
so
all you got.
that's all I got. So part of it
Yeah,
is we train people to not make instant judgments,
yeah,
exercise curiosity, ask open-ended questions. Tell me more. What is this like for you? Like those kind of questions are a start to building that empathy muscle and learning to take other people's perspectives. That's but that I can get to the second question. So yeah, being a leader is a lonely, tough, isolating gig at the best of times. The problem that I see with a lot of leaders, and I've been one myself, is this idea that showing any kind of vulnerability equates to weakness or not being up for the task. And also that role modeling, resilience and motivation. And in my 30 plus years experience, I would say that the toughest clients to deal with are senior leaders because it's a difficult, and we talk about stigma. There's stigma from the outside world, but there's also internalized stigma that I should be stronger than this. This shouldn't happen to me. I need to show that I'm capable, right? All those internal dialogues, but it's very clear. When a leader is not at their best, emotionally, psychologically, or physically, they cannot lead at their best. So you got to be a highly functioning individual to lead at your best. And
yeah,
unless you address those things, you're kind of laying the foundation for problems later on, not just in
yeah.
your own life, but how you lead and the health of the organization.
Well, speaking of laying foundations, we have probably two more webinars worth of questions here. And all fantastic questions. And I wish we had more time for them all. But I think we are really digging in and providing some really good nuggets. I want to really emphasize the work that Amanda and the team at TextMed do in disability management. They do a phenomenal job. They've helped a number of our members, and we continue to promote them as a resource. Again, check them out. Reach out to them, look at their website, but they do a lot of great work in support of members, especially within disability management and helping you through the claims process, getting your workers back to work. And they're right in the middle. They're like Switzerland, just like us, right? They don't work for WorkSafe. They don't work for the employer. They're there to really get the worker back to work and get them working again as well. So thank you, Amanda, for joining us
Thank
today.
you. Oh,
And of course, our own Dr. Conway. Steve, as you know, you hear him at our Make It Safes on our webinars. He does a lot of great work on site with employers. He has developed a lot of programs, a lot of courses. So please do reach out if you think there's something that we can help you with. Steve is doing a lot of leadership training, EQ development, because we know it's one of the things that Steve and I are working on is really those training programs that will help those shift leaders, supervisors, managers, and people leaders learn skills along the way that will help them be more effective in their roles, but better people leaders. So again, check us out for that.
And I would one
Um,
more plug for
yeah,
Amanda.
please,
If
please
you Amanda has a lot of great stuff to say. So Amanda presents at our Make It Safes. So
check
come
it
and
out.
listen to her in action. She's fantastic.
Yeah, we are
thanks.
very, very fortunate. We've got some great, sharp people. So check us out. Again, I have a couple announcements. I'll just go through. If you've missed the window to nominate your company for Safety Committee or for the Safety Excellence Award, we've extended the nomination period until tomorrow. Get your nominations in to the Manufacturing Safety for the Innovator, Fantastic Four, Control Leader, Small Business People First, Culture of Courage Awards, and many, many more. Again, we want to celebrate those organizations, those people that really have making a difference in their workplaces. Our upcoming Pinnacle Awards. So please find the nominations link in the chat. Again, plan ahead, learn with your team and local safety community at the Make It Safe Vancouver Island, March 31st, and the Make It Safe Okanagan, April 23rd. Advanced registration savings are available now, so please take advantage of them before it ends March 6th. Even if you're not a member, you can take advantage and save 20% when you book on-site training before February 27th. This is kind of our time to kind of load up the savings, and that's for any class before September 30th. So please do check out. We're gonna this year we're gonna pass over 100 courses on our LMS and many other courses through our instructor-led training, etc. So please do check us out for your training needs. As you leave today, again, it's so important that you give us feedback on topics, on things that are important to you, even for our Make It Safes. That's so important. We want relevant topics that can help you in your organization, bringing in speakers that will resonate and you can take those nuggets back. So, again, please let us know in the short survey. Really important for us so that we can bring you, again, quality programs. Thanks again for joining us and watch for a follow-up email with the recording for today's webinar so that you can listen to it again if you missed anything. And we look forward to seeing you next time at our next webinar and at our next Make It Safe in March in Nanaimo. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great day, everyone.